Hello and welcome to the Endurance Science Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to cut through the noise and misinformation that social media presents us and discuss what the science really says about endurance performance. My name is Matt Carpenter. I'm a lecturer in sports science at the University of Northampton, just coming towards the end of my PhD. And today's episode is one that I've wanted to do for a very long time. This episode tackles one of the most important and possibly most overlooked skills in endurance sport and really highlights the intersection between research and marketing from social media companies. And so my aim from this episode is to make you more aware and more able to see through the claims that companies provide with a bit of an insight into how they can make those claims in the first place. And so I'll be looking at how to actually read and evaluate scientific research and how to spot BS claims. So I'm going to look through the world of predatory publishing, break down what Beale's list is and why everyone should know about it, and look through some practical red flags to look at when reading a paper or evaluating a claim, particularly looking at why individual studies should never be taken in isolation. The core message is that science is a body of evidence. It's not a single study. It's not a single headline. It's about taking into account all the research done on a topic. I've had people quite regularly ask me to do a video on how they can read research. And I think what I wanted to do is combine how to read research with how to spot misleading claims, because the two really go hand in hand. And so that's what this video is all about. And for me, it really is inspired by endless scrolling through social media and seeing claims that are clearly too good to be true. New research proves that supplement X increases your VO2 max by 15%, and they'll cite a study. And these kind of claims are absolutely everywhere, and almost every supplement will have them. I'm not going to name specific supplements that are prone to these because it's really the company themselves, and even supplements with good evidence can still use misleading research to make misleading claims. But the crux is here that not all research is created equal. Not all scientific studies are of equal reliability and validity. Not all journals are created equal. And there's an entire industry of predatory publishing, which is used by many companies, not knowingly, often just because they aren't as research literate as they maybe should be. So not knowingly misleading, but using very poor research that's been created or published through these predatory publishers to support or try and sell their product. And so in this episode, I want to open the door on what predatory publishing is, what predatory journals are, why they exist, and how they are all over the world of scientific publishing, with sports science no exception to that. I'm going to take you through something called the Beale's list in detail. Now, this list, if you Google Beale's list, B-E-A-L-L, Beale's list, you'll be able to see it. We'll go through what it is, how to use it, and why it's such an important tool, at least in my experience. Then I'll talk about how to actually read a study, what to look for, what the red flags are, and why you should never buy a supplement based on the claims made by the company itself and by claims that are the product of single research papers or small bodies of research, particularly if they're in less esteemed journals. So the aim is to look at how to evaluate a body of research, what that actually means, and how to think like a scientist. So to start off with, something that everyone should know about, predatory publishing. What is it? Now, this sounds really sciencey, but it's actually pretty simple to understand. The way scientific publishing is supposed to work is that a researcher or a team of researchers will conduct a study. They'll write it up as a manuscript with an introduction, a methods section, a results section, a discussion, with a conclusion at the end on their findings. They submit it to a journal. And that journal goes through a multi-step process of deciding whether it is worthy of submission to that journal. It involves going to an editor who will decide based on a very quick overview of whether it's worth sending out to reviewers. If it is, it'll go to peer reviewers, usually 2 peer reviewers, but it can be more. 2 peer reviewers that will read the study with a fine-tooth comb, particularly looking at the methods, the results, and deciding, is it a strong enough fit? Is it a good enough fit for the journal? Is the research controlled well enough to be of use? It's not about whether it found something useful or found something that is null, so found no difference. Often there is undertones of that, but it should be purely on, is this study novel? Is it conducted well? Therefore, is it able to be published? Is it good enough for publication. If the peer reviewers agree, typically it will get published. If it doesn't, it will get rejected or maybe sent back for revisions. And now the peer review process itself is far from perfect. You get a huge publication bias where studies that do show a result are more likely to get published, which is a huge issue, particularly in things like supplements, where there's even supplements that do have good bodies of evidence, may well have lots of research papers unpublished because they found nothing, which will impact then things like your meta-analyses. Because if a meta-analysis is analysing all the published research, and research that finds positive results is more likely to get published, well then the meta-analysis itself will get skewed. So peer review itself isn't perfect, although saying that meta-analyses can analyse the risk of bias within studies. So there are ways to control for it, but there is an issue with peer review. It's not perfect, but it gives you at least a meaningful filter of quality. So what's the difference between that traditional publishing and predatory publishing? Well, predatory publishing skips all of the processes that I've just outlined. A predatory journal looks like a real journal, publishes like a real journal. It will have a real website. It'll often have an editorial board. It'll sometimes have academics listed on their site. Sometimes those academics won't even know that their names are being used to give validation to that site. And it will claim to do peer review. In reality, these predatory publishers are using the highly lucrative business model of publishing and getting academics or the universities, the institutions, to pay their APC, the article processing charge, and publish your data. Now, what that means for the predatory publishers is they will accept whatever comes along because it means they get the APC, the article processing charge, which is often thousands of pounds for a study. There's no meaningful review of the study, no quality controls, no gatekeeping or anything like that. And it was Jeffrey Beall, the writer of the Beall's List, who really demonstrated this problem. So Jeffrey Beall first coined the term predatory publishing around 2008. And he started tracking these publishers because he noticed that he was getting loads of emails from journals that he'd never heard of, inviting him to submit papers or join editorial boards. Speak to anyone in academia, and I'm sure their junk email is absolutely full to the brim of predatory publishers emailing them asking for publications. I'm certainly not an exception to that. As soon as I published my first study, my name was clearly on some kind of list somewhere because I have hundreds of junk emails from predatory publishers trying to get me to publish in their journals. Again, they're doing it so I can pay the APC, the article processing charge, so they can make money. It's all it is a money-making scheme. And what you'll notice is that these emails are written very poorly. There's errors, there's promises of rapid publication, all these kind of things. And so Bill started tracking this. And as of 2016, it had grown from 18 publishers to over 900. And those 900 publishers ran thousands and thousands of individual journals because each publisher can run multiple journals. And so Beall's List at one point accounted for over 21,000 individual titles. So that's 21,000 journals that on paper look legitimate. And if a supplement company comes along and says, here's a study from X journal, and it shows a 15% increase in VO2 max, well, it's hard at first glance to see that it was published in a predatory journal. But what this means is you've got over 20,000 journals that are looking to essentially publish any article with no quality control. Really, anyone could publish anything there. The methods mean nothing. The quality of the research itself, irrelevant. But what this means is that anyone that isn't research literate, and again, people starting supplement companies, even with all the goodwill in the world, aren't always perfectly research literate. Sometimes they are, depending on their background. It's very easy to fall for predatory publishing and the research coming out of predatory publishers. And so you may think, okay, this is clearly a problem within academia, which it is, but how does it affect me as an endurance athlete? Well, the problem is that these studies don't stay in academic databases. These studies may get shared on social media. They may get cited by supplement companies, by coaches, by influencers. Once a study has got a DOI number, it's got its journal name attached to it, it looks good, it looks real, and it can then be used to sell a product. And although it sounds cynical, and this isn't me throwing shade on anyone with a supplement company, because I speak to many owners of companies that have got no problem with the vast majority of them. And my experience is that the majority of people that own companies are doing it for absolutely the right reasons. They believe in what they're selling and they want to know everything about it. They want to know the science earnestly. But what predatory publishing does is it really makes it harder to understand where true benefits lie to certain supplements, and it muddies the water between what works, what doesn't work, and that is a huge issue. So the classic example within sports science is that a company might want to claim that their product improves your endurance performance. They might fund a small study of 8 to 10, maybe even 12 people with poor methods, and there are so many examples of this. Mushroom cordyceps is a brilliant one, where there's papers that should never see the light of day because their methods are so poor, but they get submitted to predatory journals, and as a result, they get published, and therefore they can be used to sell supplements or to claim that supplements have wild benefits that they most likely don't have. And remember, when we're looking at research, it's never a binary yes or no. Just because a paper has been published in a predatory journal, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong. It just increases the likelihood that it's unreliable. And again, it means that you'll need to take longer in the methods section to really see if you can trust that research. Unfortunately, people wanting to sell you things may not be too worried about the strength of the research as long as it tells them what they want so they can use it as part of their marketing strategy. So predatory publishing, and something that I talk a lot about, which is the use of science as a marketing strategy, which is a huge issue within supplement companies and research around endurance exercise, really go hand in hand. Poor quality studies are getting published in predatory journals, and they're being used as the marketing strand of many companies within endurance, not just supplements, really all sorts. And what that means is you'll see companies put out things like clinically proven or 10 studies have shown benefits or these kind of claims. And unless you dig deeper, you have no reason to doubt it. And as the saying goes, it's something on the lines of the claim gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to rear its head. That's definitely not the saying, but you know what I mean. It takes such a long time to debunk these things that once the claim goes out there, it's very hard to stop. About this time last year, every other TikTok I was scrolling past was saying CMOS contains 92 essential nutrients, and it was constant. Everyone was saying the same thing. And it culminated in me watching a video from Tottenham Hotspur's TikTok, where Dejan Kulusevski, one of my favorite players, used that exact same quote that I'd heard from all these TikTok marketers. And that is a claim getting all the way onto an elite athlete and resulting in him essentially promoting a product with no clear benefits, with no context. CMOS containing lots of essential minerals is that it's just so high in sodium that you can't get meaningful amounts of really anything else. You may as well just put salt on your food. And so it's really that attack on, well, the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of evidence bases. And this is really important because, number one, as an endurance athlete, you don't want to waste your money on things that don't work. And number two, it makes it harder to know what does work and what doesn't work. And it takes time to analyze research and to fact check all these constant claims. And just to show you how mental this problem is, and I don't use that word lightly, in 2013, a journalist called John Bohannon ran like a little, I guess, sting operation for Science magazine. So he created a completely made up study, fabricated the data with clear flaws in the methods, and submitted it under a fake name, under a fake institution, and sent it to 304 journals. Of the journals that completed the review process itself, 82% accepted the paper. So 82% of potentially predatory journals are accepting a paper that is completely made up with clear methodological flaws. It's essentially not going through peer review. You can publish anything. And these sorts of sting operations have been done over and over again, where people have published joke articles, even ones saying things like, please don't publish this, as the title. There was another brilliant experiment where researchers created a fictional academic called Anna Oszust. Oszust is translated to fraud in Polish. And they applied for editorial positions at a number of predatory journals. 40 predatory journals accepted this made-up individual as an editor, sometimes in the day that they applied. Compared to that, there's no surprise that not a single journal that's listed on reputable websites accepted this person as an editor. And so you can see what's happening here in the predatory journal space is There is no quality control. And so, how is this showing up in endurance sport? Well, if we think about all the different claims that we encounter within the endurance space, it's not just about supplements, it's training, it's nutrition, altitude training masks, supplements, dosing protocols, different types of periodization, optimal forms of training, all the different gadgets there are for recovery. There's so many things that are being researched, but what is the research behind these claims? If someone's citing a study, it's not enough now just to say, here's a paper that shows what I wanted to show. Because how do we know the trustworthiness of that study? Frankly, even if there's an encouraging study published in a top journal, it's insufficient to say, here's a study that proves, quote unquote, that you should take or do the program I'm telling you to do, whether that be a supplement or a recovery gadget. And just to add to that, if it's in a predatory journal, even worse. But I'll talk about I'll talk about individual studies later on. But I've seen supplement companies reference studies from journals that when you look them up are clearly predatory journals. And one way you can check this is to use Beale's list, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, often the journal websites that you'll see for predatory journals look like they were made in the early 2000s. And again, it's not just about supplements here. We're talking about different types of training. We're talking about recovery, anything that involves ergogenic aids, ways to improve performance, anything that can be researched. Well, predatory publishing is coming for the whole of science. And now, why I think sports science is particularly at risk to predatory publishing is that marketing and the sort of consumerist side of things is so strong. Sports science research is not just research, it gets used for marketing. And translation of science is really important. It's why I started my podcast, is why I started doing social media. But one of the reasons I did that is because I saw so many people translating science poorly. And one of the reasons it gets translated poorly is because so much poor research is published, particularly in predatory journals, and that quality control step is not there. And it means that a supplement company can jump onto a wild claim that has no bearing in reality. And so that takes us to Beale's list. I want to talk about this in a bit more detail because I think this is, well, I've spent hours looking through this list. And I think it's really interesting and a really good retort to predatory publishing. And it's really shone a light on it for me. So Jeffrey Beale was a librarian based at the University of Colorado in Denver. And as I mentioned, he was receiving a lot of spam emails from publishers that he deemed dubious. And so he began doing something, I guess, innovative at the time, which was investigating the publishers themselves, looking through their editorial boards, looking through their peer review claims, their business practice, and their lack of transparency. And he compiled Beale's list. And again, you can find this by typing in Beale's list on Google or any other platforms. And Beale's list was his compilation of what he called potential, possible, or probable predatory scholarly open access publishers. In short, these were journals that were publishing with the potential of being predatory. Now, he was very careful with his wording, potential predatory publishers, rather than making it a definitive blacklist. It was more of a watch list than a blacklist. In practice, it became the go-to resource for academics trying to figure out whether a journal was legitimate. And so what criteria was Jeffrey Beale using to create this watch list? Well, his criteria, which he published himself, is something that is really useful for anyone else to understand when they're looking at any journal articles themselves. And it starts off with transparency. If a publisher won't clearly disclose who owns them or what their editorial policies were, that in itself is a red flag. The second is either a missing or misleading editorial board or one that's completely fake. Some predatory journals would list prominent academics on their boards without any knowledge or any consent. Some just wouldn't have an editorial board at all. The big one, though, is no true peer review process. Now, for all of peer review's flaws, which there are many, it at least is a way to prevent poor research being published as best as possible. And so if a journal claims to do a peer review but accepts papers within days of submission or accepts papers that have clear methodological flaws, it's almost guaranteed there's no true peer review going on. The final one, which is very common, is misleading claims about impact factors. So how often is work from that journal cited from other research? And often they're just in clearly fake metrics. things like global impact factor or universal impact factor, which aren't real but mimic the legitimate impact factor that journals are judged partly by. There were two final aspects that Beale looked for. One was no digital preservation policy. So legitimate, proper, quote-unquote journals will list archived content so that when the journal ceases to exist, the research itself is preserved. Often predatory journals don't bother with any of the archiving, which means if they shut down, all the research published in that journal will just disappear into the ether, which tells you all you need to know about how they value the scientific research that they're publishing. And finally, aggressive solicitation. So this is the constant spam emails or the urgency that is promoted. I quite often get emails from predatory publishers saying, "Dear Dr. Carpenter," I'm not a doctor yet. "Dear Dr. Carpenter, we still haven't heard back from you from your last email. Please reply as we have a new publication date for the 1st of April if you can submit in the next 7 days." These kind of things. This is not the way that legitimate journals exist. But again, these predatory journals exist to make profit, and they make profit from people paying to publish their work. Now, by the way, that's how all journals profit. But predatory journals just skip all the processes that make sure good quality work is published. And that is the issue. And so by late 2016, as mentioned, Beale's list had over 900 publishers and more than 1,200 standalone journals. It became the most widely referenced tool for identifying predatory publishers in the world. But alongside that came controversy, and that largely came through threats of legal action and criticism of Beale himself. There were threats to sue Jeffrey Beale for upwards of $1 billion. There was accusations of bias, particularly suggesting that Beale was overly critical of open access journals themselves. And so in 2017, the list itself was taken offline. And now, thankfully, the list itself didn't completely disappear. There's an archived version that's maintained at bealeslist.net, which is the one that I use quite regularly. What that means is that it's slightly frozen in time. And so there are many publishers that should be on Beale's list that aren't on there, but it's still a fantastic starting point, and the methodology in it is useful to know to understand the idea of predatory publishing and what to look out for. But just because something's published in a non-predatory journal, it doesn't mean that it's therefore perfectly reliable. No study is perfect, and as I mentioned, we can never take clear takeaways, or at least we can never decide if something is good or bad using those binary terms from one paper alone. And this is where we have to think about the idea that single studies are never enough. And this is the part of the episode that I really want to drive home, because this goes beyond predatory publishing. Even if a paper is published in Science or in Cell, some top journals in the world, one paper is not enough to change the way we see a single approach to endurance performance. Now, it could form the basis of a new area of research. It could form the basis of a body of literature, but one single study cannot be taken in isolation. And this is really an even more common issue I see with the world of marketing and sports science, because a single study is a single data point. And even if it's a perfectly designed study, which it might be, even if it's published in a fantastic journal, MSSE is a great sports science journal, for example, we could have impressive results, but it's still just one study conducted on one specific group of individuals, one cohort, in a specific context, at a specific moment in time. And with all those caveats, you still get randomness in data. And so, as a result, it's really important to take a body of literature rather than single studies. And this is why whenever you see a claim that sounds too good to be true, it almost definitely is. And it's almost definitely taking results of a single study. Maybe a poor study, maybe a fantastic study, but data from a single study. And this is where hierarchies of evidence are really important. At the bottom of the hierarchy of evidence, you have things like expert opinion, case studies, and anecdotal reports. Anecdotal reports are everywhere within endurance exercise. People trying new supplements or trying new approaches to training because they see an influencer doing it, because they've heard that it's what the Inga Britsons do, all these kind of things. That in itself is not good evidence. I would contest that Using my area of supplements in endurance exercise, even supplements that do improve performance, the vast majority of people will not notice a difference if they're taking them or not, because the difference is so small. That's different with elite athletes who are much more sensitive to change. I think they would notice those differences. But if you gave the average person beetroot juice on one day and not beetroot juice the next day, it'd be very hard for them to tell the difference, even though there is a true benefit, most likely, to beetroot. And so when someone comes up to you at your running club and says, I felt so good after I started taking X, that is not a good standard of evidence. And it's almost certainly impacted by the placebo effect. And I'll dedicate a whole episode to this soon, because this is endemic within endurance exercise and these anecdotal reports, that the placebo effect is so much stronger than the effect of any supplement or arguably any specific type of training. And so you cannot disentangle benefits from a different type of training or a different supplement regime or a different nutrition approach to the placebo effect. They can generate hypotheses, but it's not strong evidence by itself. As we move up the evidence hierarchy, we get to things like cohort studies, cross-sectional studies, case-controlled studies. Here we can start to look at associations and the impacts of certain aspects of nutrition or performance amongst different metrics. What we're really looking for here, though, is correlations and associations with observational data. For example, looking at the role of VO2 max and exercise performance. We'll see a correlation between VO2 max and endurance exercise performance. And that will lead some people to focusing solely on VO2 max. But what you don't see is that when you get to, say, the elite start line of Olympic marathon, VO2 max does not predict performance at all. Some really interesting stuff there. Again, I'm going to talk more about VO2 max in a future episode. What we get as we move up the evidence hierarchy is more controls. Above our cross-sectional studies, we have randomized control trials. These are thought of as the gold standard for testing whether some kind of intervention actually works. This is because you have a control group that aren't receiving the intervention, but if possible, you have blinding to the intervention. So the participants don't know what they're receiving, whether it be a supplement or a training plan, etc. And the researchers don't either. And so that's what double blind study means, that the researchers and the participants don't know what they're getting. Now, this is important because you get things like unconscious biases from researchers that might mean that without thinking, they, encourage someone more when they're exercising and they're taking a certain supplement, these kind of things. And it's important, obviously, for the participants because it removes or limits the chance for placebo effect. Now, there are some instances where it's very hard to perform a true blinding. What you can do there is try and minimize any placebo effects. So you can, for example, in a training study, it's very hard to blind someone to their training because they've got to do it. But if you compare two different training programs, then you may limit the chance of a placebo effect. You've still got a control group that are having some kind of intervention. There are some supplements that taste disgusting, so it can be hard to blind them. This is where you can look at ways to best blind the study. And there are ways to actually analyze or assess whether the blinding of the study worked. And so when you start to dig into the weeds of research, you can start to see whether, for example, a randomized control trial was truly blinded. But at the top of the evidence hierarchy, you have systematic reviews and meta-analyses. The idea of a systematic review is to take all the available research on a specific question. So, say, does sodium bicarbonate enhance endurance performance? And use a structured set of searches, transparent methodology to analyze the results of all the published research. Now, this is the difference between a systematic review and a narrative review. There was a recent narrative review, it was actually my second podcast, I believe, looking at whether carbohydrate really improves performance. And the main claim from that narrative review was that we don't need as much carbohydrate as being spoken about. And they suggested that on the lower end, 10 grams a day is sufficient 10 grams an hour is sufficient to improve performance. Now that was a narrative review, not a systematic review. What that means in reality is that narrative reviews, there is no structured way of choosing papers. And so it gives researchers the opportunity to choose whichever papers they see fit to fit their narrative. A systematic review has a certain series of criteria to take out that researcher bias that narrative reviews can have, which is why they're considered more reliable. Now, if you're adding a meta-analysis onto a systematic review, this goes further and pulls statistical data from the study to calculate an overall effect. And this is what makes meta-analyses the most powerful of research tools. Now, again, this doesn't mean meta-analyses are perfect, because if you put a bunch of rubbish studies into a meta-analysis, you're just going to get an analysis of a bunch of rubbish studies. But this is where inclusion criteria become important, and including only well-conducted, well-controlled trials and analysing them as a group will give you very good and very helpful results. And so even meta-analyses are very much subject to bias, particularly because, as I mentioned, studies are more likely to get published if they find positive results. And that will skew a meta-analysis. If all you're publishing are the positive results and you're not publishing the results where you find no difference, well then a meta-analysis studying the overall effect of a supplement may accidentally find a benefit because all the studies showing no benefit weren't published. And so good meta-analyses can account for these things and factor them into their analysis as well. And the whole point of meta-analyses is that replication is super important. One single study may give you a result that is not replicated by subsequent research. And there's a number of reasons this might happen. Number one, randomness. If you're going to do 2, 3, 4, 5Ks for a study, so run a 5K and multiple times, you're not going to run the same time exactly every single time. And so when you're looking at the effect of a supplement, you are going to see differences in results. And so it can be hard to differentiate randomness and chance from a true effect, especially when we're looking at quite small differences. And so that's why you might see a study that shows X supplement improves performance. That doesn't mean it actually does. It just means that that's what that study found. Again, we're always working on the balance of probability, and that's where replication is really important. When you start to see multiple studies conducted in multiple labs finding similar results, that's when you can start to really consider a supplement potentially having an evidence base. Sports science has a serious replication problem. Maybe not quite as bad as psychology, but it's bad. Partly because studies are expensive to do, they're time consuming, they're not very glamorous, and often they're underpowered. And so we're not getting enough participants to do each study. On top of that, as mentioned, journals prefer to publish novel results. And so they may be more likely to accept a paper if it shows something fancy or a really cool new study showing a benefit. And as a result, it makes understanding the body of literature harder. And then we get to cherry picking. This is where someone, whoever that might be, an influencer, a brand, even someone in your running club, selects 1 or 2 studies that support their position whilst ignoring the broader body of evidence that might contradict it. Or maybe the broader body of evidence doesn't even exist. And this is something you see all the time with supplement marketing. A company might highlight a study showing their product improved VO2 max. It reduced your time to run a 5K or a 10K. What they won't tell you is the quality of that study, whether it's been replicated, what other researchers said, all these kind of things. And cherry picking is my biggest bugbear within marketing on social media and supplement companies because it looks scientific. I've seen a company recently talk about 12 studies or 12 clinical studies is their claim. 10 of them aren't even published. I asked them for them. So of those, only 2 are published. But they can say 12 clinical studies conducted, and it sounds scientific, but it's not. The individual words are just about accurate, but it's extremely misleading. And this is why it's important to understand the whole body of evidence. And the issue many people face is that we live busy lives. We don't have the time to spend hours and hours and hours weighing through a body of evidence. And so what can you do as an endurance athlete? Well, the first thing is to question everything. Question how you feel. If you're taking a supplement, are you really feeling a benefit from that supplement? Or is it a placebo? That's something to consider internally. And I have to do that with myself all the time. It's also then important to look at both sides. If you're seeing a claim from someone, can they back it up? Sometimes it's as easy as asking for the studies. I've had so many supplement companies that have made claims and I just said, oh, can you send me the research on these claims? And you either hear nothing or you hear some kind of mishmash answer where they won't even send you the research, likely because they don't know it or it was generated by AI. But there we go. And so for those of you listening, it can feel overwhelming to be lectured at about predatory publishing and Beall's list and all these kind of things. You probably aren't listening to this podcast for research methods, but I think this is really important. And this is more than just research methodology. It's about how we make decisions on how we spend our money and what things we put into our body. And so, in terms of what you can do about this, or a practical framework you can use when you counter claims, there's a phrase my supervisor used all the time during my PhD and even my master's. Whenever I would get too into mechanisms, not that mechanisms aren't important, but he would always just say, so what? And the so what is, does it improve performance? And what does it mean? That's what I took from it, at least. So the so what test that I would use is the following. The first one is, where was it published? Was it published in a real index peer-reviewed journal? If it wasn't, then it's a big red flag. Second question is, who did the study and are there conflicts of interest? Are there affiliations? These are always listed at the bottom of a research paper, underneath the conclusions, above the references. You can check this. And just because a study or authors have conflict of interest, it doesn't mean you cannot trust the study, but it's something to take into consideration. Number 3 is the design of the study. Was it blinded? Is an easy thing to look for. In the method section, was it single blind? Was it double blind? Was it placebo controlled? These things are all really important because of the placebo effect. Question 4 is, what did the study actually find? Because I've seen so many times, and again, not to call anything out, mushroom cordyceps, people will give a big claim, improves VO2 max by 10%, whatever it might be. And you look at the study, and actually, it's a perfectly well done study that hasn't really shown anything like what is being claimed. Or they might take one tiny finding and use it out of context when actually the main findings of the study are, say, no change in performance, or in this case, both the control group and the supplement group improve their VO2 max. And the supplement company decides to disregard the control group and say, look, here, the supplement improved VO2 max, not taking into account the fact that so did the placebo group that didn't consume anything. And so from that, and some of these take time because you've got to read the research, you've got to understand research, and that can be difficult. And so the easiest one really is to say, has it been replicated? Has it happened since? If there's a study that keeps getting cited, but no one researched it subsequently, there's probably a reason for that. If something truly improved performance, there wouldn't be a single study done 10 years ago that no one's really bothered doing since. So is there a big body of research? Has it been replicated? And what does other research find? So if there's a research paper showing that something improves VO2 max by 10%, are there other research papers that have also shown benefits? Is there a clear body of evidence all pointing the same way? And this is where you can start to look for systematic reviews or meta-analyses to see, does this claim that a supplement company is making agree or coincide favorably with the whole body of evidence? And so it can be hard to look for, is a claim true or is there truth behind it? But this is the easiest one. If someone has a supplement and they claim it does something magic, type in the name of that supplement with the words meta-analysis afterwards into Google or Google Scholar and have a look and see what meta-analyses say. And then you can start to look at the methods for that analysis. So this is really how I would suggest approaching any claim. And what I would say is, that sounds like quite a lot, but if you're going to be parting ways with sometimes 30, 40, 50 pound a month for a supplement, it's worth knowing if it's actually going to improve your performance or whether the evidence suggests that it might. And so this is all worth doing. And I think the starting point is always to be skeptical. Assume you're being lied to. And then you can change your mind if the evidence suggests so. And you can do that by evaluating the studies being cited, looking at the design, whether it was blinded, funding, the conflicts of interest, the number of people they've tested, the sample size. Were they testing 8 to 10 people, or did they have a large number of people being tested? And then, most importantly, can you find meta-analyses that agree with this? And again, even if you do, it doesn't mean surefire that this is a supplement that will improve your performance, but it gives you a better layer of trust. So is this finding consistent with systematic reviews and meta-analyses? Has it been replicated, or is this just a convenient result that someone is sharing because it's going to help them sell a supplement? If you follow these steps, you'll be ahead of almost everyone that engages with research in the endurance space. And so to summarize, and apologies, this was not as directly sport related as my usual posts, but really this is more important than all of them in my view, because this is about more than me saying this supplement good, this supplement bad. It's about having the tools to analyze for yourself what supplements may improve your performance, or what nutritional tools, what ergogenic aids, all these kind of things. Again, this is not limited to one area of science, it's the whole scientific body. So to summarize, predatory publishing is widespread, it's not going away, and it's particularly exploited by marketing of companies in the nutrition and endurance space. It exploits the open access publishing model with almost no quality control and allows bad science to look indistinguishable from good science to the untrained eye. Beall's list, and still very useful in its current archived form, is a really useful starting point for identifying suspect publishers. And when you read a study, don't just stop at the abstract. Look at the design, look at the sample size, the controls, whether it was blinded, and if there were any conflicts of interest. Most importantly, don't treat a single study or a single claim made by a supplement company as definitive proof of anything. Science is a body of evidence, not a single research finding. It's the accumulated weight of a number of studies, ideally synthesized through things like meta-analyses. And this will help you make truly evidence-based decisions. So if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from this episode, it's to be critical and to be skeptical. Being evidence-based doesn't mean citing a study. In fact, sometimes citing a study is the opposite of being evidence-based. Being evidence-based means understanding how to evaluate the quality and the context of a whole research body and the consistency of research behind claims being made. And that is a skill, and just like any skill, it requires practice. Thank you for listening. I hope that didn't sound too ranty, and I hope that was interesting. If it was a little bit too research methods heavy, then I do apologize. But we're back to fundamentals of sports science next week. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please drop a follow if you haven't already. Please drop a 5-star review. Helps us push our way up the podcast charts. And I'll see you all next week.